Okay, welcome everybody to our July 22nd Ornamental IPM program webinar from Rutgers Cooperative Extension. I'm Bill Errickson, and I'm joined here with Steve Rettke, our IPM program associate in Monmouth County, and Tim Waller, our Cumberland County agent, and Erin Quinn, our IPM support staff. And we're going to be talking about some contemporary issues in IPM, some insects and disease and beneficial insects that we're seeing at this time of the year throughout New Jersey. And we're going to be talking about different chemical materials. So just a disclaimer, make sure you have your proper licensing, and that varies from state to state. So we're talking about today is applicable to commercial growers in New Jersey, but that may change based on your state or if you're a landscaper versus a farmer. So some of the things we're going to be talking about today are predaceous mites and juniper wedworm, azalea whiteflies, some bark cracks, dog day cicadas, European hornets, orange-striped oakworm, tulip tree aphids, vascular disorders and diseases, some imaging resources, and then we'll talk about a guest lecture we're going to be having next week, which is exciting. So that's all coming up, all things that we're seeing throughout the state this time of the year. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see our growing degree day tracker for about where we're at for this time of the year. In northern New Jersey, it's around 1,710 growing degree days. In central New Jersey, where we are located, is about 1,900. And in southern New Jersey, down by Tim Waller, is around 2,025 growing degree days. So you can use that as a reference as we go through and look at these different insects.
All right, everyone. So I'm going to hop in here just for a second for some of these updates. Wanted to just point out a few things that have been called into the office, or I've been called about, or people came in with samples and we took a look with the scopes that we have. So we've seen pear psyllid in a couple instances. I know this isn't a very common pest, but it has been reported on both the fruit tree versions of pear as well as ornamental. And the reason I wanted to pull these pictures up here is that at some of its life stages, particularly in the nymphal stage, it looks very similar to a potato leafhopper. Also has been active, and we've been seeing samples coming in with mysterious, whether it's curling or edge burn, i.e. the hopper burn. We've also been seeing this as well. So I just wanted to make a note here that these two, you may see activity of both of these pests, and we just wanted to have a picture up here so you knew what you were looking at. One of the big differentiators, other than the size of them, the potato leafhopper is going to be a little bit larger in most cases through its life stages, but the leafhoppers will do that side-to-side motion, which is very indicative that you're dealing with a leafhopper. Controls for both of those pyrethroids are going to be valuable. Just bear in mind it can impact our beneficial populations, and we need to get it to the parts of the plants where these insects are, oftentimes the underside of the plant tissues. Systemics can be effective as well, but we're rapidly running out of time to be impactful on them because they do take quite a while to get going. Next update is for those with conifers, Christmas tree growers. Cryptomeria scale is rapidly approaching its second generation throughout the state. This is a great time to get out there with your hand lens, see if you can see some of the crawler activity moving around. They're tiny little yellowish crawlers that will be in and around where the older adults were from the first generation and the cast bodies of previous year generations. So just wanted to make note that they are going to be active very soon here, but just bear in mind too that if particularly twice stabbed lady beetle, if you see it out there, it's a really good indicator that you've got good beneficials and good pressure there. So choosing your materials to guard them can be a very valuable tool. The presence of these ladybird beetles is also a valuable tool that we do have activity in the pests in our conifers. So given this is an armored scale, and we've talked about this before, you can go back through our previous information, but we just wanted to include it here as well. There are a number of materials available, but like I said earlier, being cognizant of your beneficial insects is something that's very important, particularly in a crop system like Christmas trees, where you may not be as heavy-handed with your spray approaches. So using things in the IGR, insect growth regulator category, can be really beneficial. And the last thing that we saw this when we were out looking, scouting at a farm the other day, and it's something you're going to see throughout the state. We were in the southern part of central New Jersey, if that exists. But we saw a pretty high abundance of tulip true scale on a tulip. And what you might be seeing this time of year are aggregations of ants. And basically, these ants are protecting the scales, the adult scales. They're feeding on their excrement, the honeydew, and they're protecting them from beneficial insects coming in and taking them out. What you're probably going to see is a lot of sooty mold or a shiny appearance. And it's a really good indicator that we're dealing with a soft scale. We're seeing this lots of sooty mold and lots of ant activity. Reason we wanted to bring this up here is, although that you are seeing this right now, the crawler period is not for a little bit of time, particularly the more north you go in the state, and they've got an elongated crawler period. The soft scale crawlers are a little bit more susceptible to treatment efforts. So if we wait a little bit longer, we're going to talk about this in detail in one of our future iterations of this program. But you may be seeing it now, but delaying your sprays, you're going to get more bang for your buck and better control of a larger population than hammering it this time of year.
All right, thanks, Tim. And just a reminder too, we have a new website based on this program. All of these recordings get posted up there, and these slideshows make really good printable field guides. So we thank everybody who has been a part of the program and who joins us live. And then for folks who are watching the recordings also, you can go and check this out on the website. It's all being staged there. All right, so continuing to talk about beneficial insects, I want to take some time to talk about our predaceous mites, especially because as we start to see hot and dry weather during this time of the year, spider mite populations start to increase and we start to see more and more damage from them. And when you're scouting for spider mites, you want to look a little bit more closely to see if there are predaceous mites present. And they're usually going to find them in the spider mite populations because that's their food source. And so they can look very similar, but the predaceous mites, they're shiny and unspotted pear shape, and their hairs are less pronounced than spider mites. So if we look at the picture here, the mite on the left is a predaceous mite, and it's feeding on the spider mite on the right. And we'll see a few more pictures of them to be able to distinguish them. But really a good way to tell them apart is based on their movement. So the spider mite or the predaceous mites move much faster than spider mites. So if you're scouting for mites and you're using a beating tray, like we had talked about in one of our previous webinars, where you knock the mites, off of the leaves and they land on the tray, if you see really fast movement, then you have an indication that you have predatory mites. And you may even see them moving fast on the plants as well. So keep an eye out for that. And they can consume a fair number of spider mites or other prey species, pest mites that are in the landscape or in the nursery. So these can really help with some of your controls. And so here we see a few different images. Again, it's shiny, pear-shaped, usually tan-ish color. They can get a little bit reddish orange, especially if they've been feeding. And then they can change color like that. And sometimes they can be a little bit larger than the species that they're feeding on, a little bit larger than the spider mite. So you see the three different pictures of the predaceous mites there. And then in the top right, that's actually a release of predaceous mites. You can actually purchase these and release them. So they're commercially available because they do offer some pretty good control of mite pests. So when we're thinking about, how we want to work with these beneficials in our operations, if the spider mite populations are pretty low, consider not spraying them and allow the predaceous mites to build up their populations and to feed on the pests to keep them below threshold levels. So everybody's got a different threshold. Maybe that's a little bit higher in the landscape versus the nursery if you're trying to sell plants, especially if it's in that year. But if you're not selling it that year and you've got a little bit of spider mite population, you may just want to allow the predaceous mites to take care of things. Or you can also purchase predaceous mites commercially and release them. So that can help to increase your populations and get that control. However, keep in mind, once they eat up all the prey, they might disperse a little bit. So they're going to go and find another food source. And if the pest populations return, because spider mites, they have multiple generations throughout the summer, if the pests come back and you don't have a good way to foster the predaceous mites, you may need to redeploy them. So keep that in mind, and also creating naturalized areas to be a good habitat for the predaceous mites, then they can be present in your operation. So when we're using sprays, especially if you find predaceous mites, you want to reduce broad spectrum insecticides, especially if you're working with miticides. You want to reduce the amount of times you're spraying miticides. Can throw things out of balance, especially because spider mites have that recurring generation and they can bounce back a little more quickly. Look for low toxicity materials. And then horticultural oils early in the spring, pre-bloom, they can help to suppress spider mites before the predaceous mites come out of their overwintering site. So it's like the spider mites are going to come out first, and then the predaceous mites come out later. So if you can time that right in the spring, you can get some good controls with oils that are not going to impact the predaceous mites. Okay, so we've got another conifer pest. These are juniper webworms. And so we start to see some of the damage this time of year, and this can also look similar to spider mite damage. And so, it takes good scouting and good monitoring to go out and take a look at this. But what you might see is needles starting to yellow on junipers. All sorts of junipers are affected by this. And then there's going to be a little bit of webbing, but the needles are going to turn brown and die. And that's kind of a little bit of a difference from spider mite symptoms. So you want to look closely there. And so adults have hatched out from May through July. They lay their eggs, and the eggs hatch fairly quickly within 10 days. And then the larvae, they start inside the needles. So they start kind of like a leaf miner inside the needles of the junipers. And then once they feed on the inside of the needle, they come out and they start to consume the outside and form a web, and then they grow from there. And so that's when we start to see that webbing damage, the yellow discoloration, and then the browning of the needles. So you see some damage up on the top picture there. You can see the frass, a little bit of webbing, dead needles. On the bottom left, we can see the larvae. The caterpillar is feeding along with the webbing there. And we see a pupal stage on the bottom center. And then on the right is the adult. That's the adult moth. And those you may not notice very easily. It almost just looks like a brown needle of the juniper. So they can be a little bit hard to distinguish if we see them, but you want to look for that discoloration of the needles, the webbing, and you may find the larva also. So if you see, discolored needles too, and a little bit of webbing, and the larvae are really young, they may still be inside the needle. So it's going to take a little bit of scouting. Bring your hand lens. Don't be afraid to look inside the needles. For management, there are some parasitoid wasps that will help to take care of the larvae. And then you can also prune out infested branches and webs if if it's a small amount, and you can remove them from the system. Reducing stress on the trees, and then looking at timing for applications. There are some contact materials that we can use, with spinosad being one of our biorational contact materials. But with any of our contacts, you have to get past the webbing. So if the insects have protected themselves, if those larval stages are protecting themselves in that web, you just got to make sure you can get that material in through and past the web. Pyrethroids can work as well, but remember those are broad spectrum, so you want to be careful with that. BT, with these being caterpillars. They can consume that. They have to eat it though, remember, and that's a good biorational material also. Systemics, if you have the timing right to get into the needles, they can be effective also, because this can get in when the young larvae start to feed and mine inside the needles before any of our contact type materials would be effective. This can help, but you have to get that on early enough that it can get into the plant and get up to where it needs to be. So I also want to talk about azalea whitefly, which we're seeing. There's several generations. There's 3 generations per season, and so we're probably seeing them, all throughout the state by now. And what we're looking at here, this picture is showing 3 different life stages there. You see the adult there, the azalea whitefly on the bottom, and then we see the nymphal stage where the black arrow is pointing, and then the egg, the green arrow. So you see, 3 different stages of the azalea whitefly there. And so the egg is going to hatch out to a crawler, and then that crawler is going to grow into a nymph. And the crawlers and the nymphs are secreting honeydew, which grow sooty mold. So this can cause aesthetic problems in particular. They've got piercing and sucking mouth parts, so they're sucking the plant sap. This can cause the leaves to yellow and curl up. So it may even look like abiotic stress at first, but if you look a little bit more closely, you may find azalea whiteflies. And if you have adults, if you disturb the plant, if you just go and brush the branches or, knock on them a little bit, a cloud of adults may fly up, and that's a good indication. They're usually going to be on the underside of the leaves, so you might not see them at first. You just have to scout, bring your hand lens, knock on the leaves with your hand, see if the adults fly, and look for those nymphs and some eggs if you can find them. So we see a few more pictures here. You can see the different life cycles here at the life stages, some adults and nymphs on the bottom there. And it's just, it's not going to look like much if you're going through quickly, but look, use your hand lens, bring it over, take a closer look, especially if you're seeing yellowing and cupping azalea leaves. There are several natural predators that can help us out with controls. Parasitic wasps, our lady beetle larvae, lacewings, predatory mites, they can all help with some of these controls. Yellow sticky traps can be good for monitoring, reducing stress, and even syringing, spraying some water can help to knock their populations off if they're present on the leaves. So scout first and see what you can find. We've got several materials that are effective, especially on the biorational side. We've got a couple different insect growth regulators that can help. Horticultural oils and soaps can also be effective. If we do treatment in the fall to knock their populations down, and then another in the spring, that can be a good way to get them dialed in. So you may have to wait to do those treatments, and if you need to do something in the more short term, we've got some of our contact materials, pyrethroids or carbaryl, and then if you have the timing right, you can get the systemics in there also. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Rettke.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And as usual, I'm the middleman of this trio of presenters. And in reverse order, I'll be speaking initially on the orange, or actually the last, I'll be speaking on orange striped oakworm and the European hornet and the annual dog day cicada. But I'm going to start off first with something that is commonly seen everywhere, even in nurseries as well as the landscape, and that's bark cracks of tree trunks. And so the first one we'll talk about, by the way, most of these cracks are not a major concern. However, they will potentially expose the tree to wood decay fungi if you have a wound or an opening, and also potentially infestations by wood-boring insects. Certainly wood-boring insects, they are much attracted to any kind of a wound that's on a tree, and so that's a potential problem. But I'm going to talk about 3 different types of cracks. I'll start off with drought cracks. And the trees that they seem to be found on most often are maple, honey locust, crabapple, mountain ash, and London plane trees. And often it's found during the first year or 2 after a tree has been planted. Okay, and so, and what the reason is they have a tendency, maybe the roots have not developed yet. They have some transplant shock. and the tree is not taking up moisture, and maybe the tree simply becomes too dry, and then cracks will sometimes develop. The good thing about this, however, is that it's typically just a one-time event. Once the tree has matured a bit more, and hopefully the roots have completed more of their development, the tree is not nearly so dry anymore, and then the crack will typically never open again, and so it'll stay closed and sealed, and so that's a good thing. And so you don't really have to worry about much after that. And these types of cracks, drought cracks, they can occur on any side of the tree. Now, there is another type of crack that occurs mostly on the southwest side. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And the next one is called a frost crack. Now, this is a bit different, although the susceptible trees are maples, sycamores, beech, and lindens. And when this occurs is that, you know, usually have and it occurs on any side of the tree as well. And this particular crack, once it occurs, will have a tendency to open and close over numerous years. And sometimes it'll open up more easily than the earlier years. And you have this freezing and thawing cycle occurs, and the cracks continue to reopen on a continual basis. Now, this does occur on any side of the tree, all right? And there will be, it doesn't really ever quite close, and so that's not a good thing. And you do develop this conspicuous callus ridge that will occur over time, as shown there, okay? All right, the other one now is the sun scald wounds. Now, this one is shown as susceptible with maples. Seems to be a trend there with maples, right? A very thin bark tree, and honey locust, fruit trees, cherries, for example, ash, oak, linden, willow. I've certainly seen them all in the landscape and in nursery with these type of sun scald wounds. Now, this wound, however, is very much directionally orientated. It's going to be the south or southwest side of the tree where there's been a sun scald that has occurred. And really, this never closes again. And typically, that wound will never seal over, and it will actually expand and get larger as the tree grows. And so this may be a little bit more of a serious problem with the wood decay fungi and the wood-boring insects, because it's always going to be open and make it more prone to those types of problems. And as you might suspect, like I indicated, that these trees are going to be younger, that are really going to get the sun scald more readily. Thin bark, deciduous trees are really going to be susceptible. And the photograph shown, I start at the upper right. I don't remember. I know the nursery I took this at, but I can't remember the species. It might be a honey locust. I'm not certain. But you can see the sun scald and the discoloration that occurred, and it occurred on multiple trees in that area, the whole same species, and that same discoloration occurred over dozens of trees. And look at these are red maples there on the upper left. Look at the wounding that occurred, one after the other, well over a couple dozen trees. Every single tree had the sun scald wound on that southwest side, and that's a close-up of that wound that never really closes again. And so this particular nursery, I mean, are those trees going to be saleable? Well, if he's going to sell them, he's going to probably have a much discounted price, and maybe in some situation, he's just going to have to remove them all. But in that case, he has to learn to maybe protect against sun scald wounds in the future when he plants new trees. All right, well, I actually threw this photograph in late. I forgot that I had it. Can cracks be created from pruning wounds? Well, yes, I think they can, but I don't know if they really amount to too much. And it's usually when the trees are really young and you're pruning them, maybe more hairline type cracks. But this particular crack, this was a cherry tree, and this particular branch that was removed did not necessarily cause the crack. But what it did is it opened up the tree, because that was only about 4 feet off the ground. That good sized branch to be so low, it's basically a scaffold branch. It was 4 feet off the ground. And so when they did remove it, it was a picnic area. And so the workers at this nursery would use there's a few picnic tables in that area, did provide good shade, but they that one branch got in the way a lot. And so they just simply pruned it many, many years ago. And guess what side that that wound is on? Southwest side. She had opened up the tree, the branch cover was gone, and then the tree developed that sun scald and the crack developed. All right, let's go to one now that I don't know if it's really a concern too much in nurseries. It's certainly active today. I was outside walking this morning and I heard them all singing, and these are the annual Dog Day cicadas. And I have a growing degree data that's very approximate. I just kind of estimated at 1,500. I don't know about that for certain, but that's when the adults begin to emerge. And they are active through much of July in New Jersey, all the way through August and into September as well. And by the time you get to mid-September, they really start to die and slow their that noisy buzzsaw type of noise that they make. And the males make that noise, and they're trying to attract females. And they include lots of trees, although I have a tendency to see them in all deciduous trees, but I also see them a lot in larger pine trees, eastern white pine trees. And when I took a photograph of them, by the way, before I kind of got ahead of myself here, that photograph from our friend Joe Boggs took of a periodical cicada. Now that is about probably 25% smaller than the annual Dog Day, and it's got a different coloration to it. The periodical cicada is really famous for that 13 to 17-year life cycle they have. It's the longest lived insect in the world, and so it only spends a short time as adults, and then most of the time it spends in the ground feeding on the tree roots, a couple, 2-3 feet down below the surface. But you see that orange coloration of the eyes, the legs are orange, and the veins are the wings are clear, but the veins also have that kind of reddish coloration, orange coloration to them. But we're not going to talk about the periodical cicada. We're talking about the annual one, which is active now. That periodical cicada is usually going to be active in the late spring period when they typically come out in certain regions of the country. They have their various broods that they come out. But we're talking about the annual Dog Day cicadas, and though they don't have just a 1-year life cycle, by the way, it's often misunderstood. They do have a 2 to 3 year life cycle. It's not the glamour girl that the periodical cicada can be. And when they come out, they don't, unlike the periodical cicadas, their screams are not synchronized, and so they come out and they're not quite as loud, and oftentimes you'll just hear one of them singing, trying to attract a mate. And then they last about 15 seconds and then they drop and it's silent again. And then maybe another one picks up. And so the nuisance level is not nearly quite what the periodical cicada can be. Okay, so. Now, the problem with this is that the mated females is shown there. There's the actual annual Dog Day cicada adult shown there in the photograph. But the females, they use their ovipositors, egg-laying organ, to insert eggs through the bark of small terminal twigs on trees. And they actually can sometimes kill the trees, and they cause the twigs to, brown, the leaves will brown. And so that's the kind of the harm that they do. And they cause the leaves to flag and that kind of thing. And I got a photograph of this slits that they create from these punctures as they lay their eggs. And they will sometimes even, as they create enough of a wound that it causes the branches to break, and sometimes the branch will just simply fall off. And but if they don't, if the branch remains intact on the tree, then the eggs will hatch, and then they will drop down to the soil as immature nymphs, and they will feed a good couple feet or 2-3 feet below the soil surface. And that's where they'll spend 2 or 3 years, depending upon their life cycle that particular annual cicada will have. But they can potentially feed on roots and weaken them, but that's probably going to be a concern with more younger trees. And more often than not, you're going to be having these cicadas feeding on older trees. And so that's probably not so much of a concern in nurseries. Maybe in some nurseries, your field-grown trees that may be going to be there for multiple years, you might have a concern with these annual Dog Day cicadas. Okay. And there's a handful of photographs here. There's an adult emergence after they emerged as there's late instar nymphs. They'll crawl up the trees, and then they'll become an adult, and they leave that pupal casket behind. They'll split it open, and that pupal casket will often remain attached to trees for a good period of time, maybe several weeks before they finally drop off. But they're empty, they're exoskeletons. And then the bottom center is showing them crawling up the trees. And oftentimes they'll crawl up a tree on the roots that they fed upon. And so they're coming up, they have been active now as far as these adults for a while, kind of maybe since, at least in our area, I first heard them singing probably around July 10th or so. And so they have been out active for a while. And then the upper top, you see the ovipositor of the female. It's not real clear, but there's a red circle there showing the ovipositor where she makes these slits and lays the eggs. Okay, and then in the upper right, you have a singing male who sings to the ladies on the pine tree. And they're kind of have a dark green color, quite distinctive, different coloration than the periodical cicadas. And they have a dark green, black eyes and dark green head area. And their wings are also clear, but their veins are green. So they kind of blend in pretty well with things like pine trees as shown there. Okay. However, now, here's the villain. There's always a villain in a love story, right? And these are the eastern cicada killer wasps. And there's a photograph of one at the upper top. And these are big, big wasps. I mean, they can get up to about 1.6 inches in size. And they are predators of only dog day cicadas. These cicada killers do not feed on the periodical cicadas, and they don't feed on anything else but these dog day cicadas. Okay, so they're really very host specific on what they go after. And the bottom left showing you a cicada killer who has, what they'll do is they'll paralyze a cicada, the annual cicada dog day. They'll hit them in midair, knock them right out of the air, and they'll paralyze them. They don't want to kill them because then what they'll do is they'll take them to their underground burrow nests that they provision for themselves. The females will, and the opening is going to be maybe the size of a nickel or so. And you can see they dig it out. They're basically a type of a digger wasp in many respects. You see they like to have their burrows, nests in soft soil and full sun. And you can see all the sand and the soil material that they dug out. And then as they drag the cicada through this soil mound that they created, it kind of creates a trail. And you can see, and they'll bring the cicada down. It's now paralyzed. It's not dead, but it brings it down into the burrow, deep into the burrow. And then the cicada killer female will lay an egg on it. And then that egg will hatch as a larvae and start feeding on fresh protein. And in fact, they will try to keep that protein fresh by initially not feeding on vital organs of the annual dog day cicada, and they'll keep it alive even longer. And they have that fresh meat for themselves. And so, yeah, nature can be pretty vicious, right? And that bottom right photograph is an area that dozens and dozens of these burrows showing at the edge of sidewalks. And an interesting story is that this is a development where I live. And unfortunately, we have neighbors who I kind of maybe understand. They're very concerned and afraid of these large wasps and thinking that they're going to be really potentially harmful to their children or grandchildren. And so I see them going out putting down insecticides. And I talk to them. I try to encourage them not to do it, but usually it's futile. And so therefore, I mean, these are predators, and they're excellent predators, and they do a nice job of trying to suppress these populations of annual dog day cicadas. And so pretty much mentioned this. I mean, you can use insecticides if you desire. I don't know of many people who will do this. And just showing you that good photograph there from Mike Raup from Maryland. You see the cicada eggs that are inserted into the tree stem. Kind of creates a V-shaped wounding area along the length of the stem. And it will often kill that stem. And so that's a good close-up of that. But there are other materials that you want to maybe try to use. Again, I don't know many who've decided to do that. And interesting thing, I don't know what this water and vinegar solution is all about. Maybe is that against the eggs, or is that against like a repellent? I'm not sure about that. So Anyway, let's move on. All right, so another one now. This is a vespid now. It's the European hornet. And this is kind of mysterious. And it's not really quite active yet. You know, they have the activity there listed at 1388 to 2271. Now, that would be now. I mean, we're definitely in that range, but I haven't seen any of these active yet. I have a few nurseries that I work with. They all get these every year. And we don't see them until August, where they certainly maybe could be first activity and you don't see them. Maybe there's not a whole lot of activity from them yet. But they will feed in damaged plants and nursery plants, very much so. Things like birch and rhododendrons and lilacs. I saw a severe population on Coosa dogwood at a nursery last few years. Now these wasps, now they're the largest true hornet in North America, so they're big. They're nowhere near the size of a cicada killer wasp is, but they're still about twice the size of bald-faced hornets. And so what they'll do is they'll gouge bark sections and mix the woody tissue with their saliva and create paper nests for their young and also feed their young. And then they also can get nourishment by feeding on the branch themselves. But you can have as many as 300 or 1,000 of these, and oftentimes you'll see them in a nest. You'll see them in tree voids, hollow tree areas. Also, you'll see them in structures like voids and dwellings. You'll see the nest can be in there as well. But I mean, they are really active August, September, October. By the time you get to November, they really shut down, and many of them start to die. And the only surviving member will be the queen in each hive. And so there are some nurseries that are really quite concerned about this because the damage they do is considerable. All right, so there's a good close-up of the damage there they do, and I don't remember what tree that is. I can't quite make it out, but if you see the bark girdling and the stripping, and what happens when they do that, and if they girdle it, then anything beyond that damaged area that's been girdled will die because it's not getting the vascular tissue has been severed, and so you get that branch will just simply die, and all the leaves will die, of course, as well. And so workers are going to be actively foraging at night, but I have seen some activity in the day as well. They can actually be good beneficial pest controls. However, one thing that they have a problem with is honeybee hives. They can create a distinctive reduction in honeybees. And so that's not usually a desirable thing, obviously. Now, they are not really, even though they've been in the literature, they say that they have the temperament of a timber rattlesnake. I don't know. I've taken some pretty close-up photographs of them, and when they're foraging, maybe they're not really too concerned about me there, and I'm within inches when I have my camera when I take photographs sometimes. I've never been stung, but they will be aggressive when you go into their nest areas, and they get very defensive, and they can be agitated. Okay. All right, there's a few more photographs showing the mandibles as they're feeding and girdling the branches. And there's that hollow tree area where actually a part of the nest kind of fell down. If you can see it right smack in the middle of the photograph. And sometimes these nests can really be a couple feet long if it's a big hollow tree. And so if you're going to try to deal with that, it's often suggested, unless you really got good experience doing such a thing, you hire a professional exterminator. And so they are social wasps, and they feed in groups as shown on the right side there. But their mandibles are quite powerful. Okay. And as far as controls, there are no controls. There are nothing labeled for them. Now, does that stop some of the nurseries from doing some practices that I certainly don't condone? No, they still do it. I'm not going to say anything. But you could try, maybe plugging up the entrance to the nest areas and the trees or the wall voids, but they're just going to probably find a new entrance that they'll create. That's not going to probably do much harm. I mean, not much benefit to it. And that's just kind of the last statement there. You hire a professional exterminator for the safe removal of the nests, and that's probably the best way to go. Okay. All right, so the last one I'll talk about is the orange-striped oakworm. Now, this is a caterpillar, good-sized caterpillar, by the way. And that 1917, I believe that's the egg hatch period. And so they're kind of a late season caterpillar. You know, we don't really see much activity of them at all as far as larvae until we get into the month of August. But they're going to feed primarily on oaks, but they will feed a bit on a few other trees, but really it's oaks and primarily on the red oak groups, you know, things like pin oaks and red oaks and scarlet oaks. And those are the trees that they prefer, and they'll lay their eggs on those trees as well. Now, the adult moths are certainly active now, and they've been active for maybe a good week, a couple weeks or so. And they have a brown, almost an orange coloration to them, and they have white spots on the good sized moth, by the way. They can be, females can be maybe close to 2 inches with a wingspan. So they're pretty big moth. And they have dark stripe down the wings. And so they're kind of distinctive to look at. And these white spots I show a photograph of. And so there's the kind of a mature caterpillar, the photograph showing you. They're kind of black as they change their coloration as they go through their instars. And these big instar caterpillars, big large caterpillars, they often have 5 or 6 instars as they go through. That's typical for most of the species. And so they kind of have an orange yellowish discoloration with the black coloration as well. And they do have these flexible horns or that they have at the back of their head area. And that's what you start to look for them now. I mean, they can begin to lay eggs. And initially the eggs are going to be up to about 50 of them on one leaf. And you see that yellow coloration of the egg shown. And then within about 10 days, they really get close to hatching, if not even sooner. They become like a dark coloration to them. And so you look for these, and one female moth, orange-striped oakworm, can lay up to about 500 moths, or rather eggs in her lifetime. But typically in a one leaf, they really maximize about 50 or so. And so that's a good photograph shown there. Look for that. And there's just one generation a year in this part of the country. If we go further south, you may have 2 generations. But they're not really harmful to especially larger trees. They're not really harmful because they're such a late season defoliator. Our late season defoliators, they're not going to really impact the health of the tree dramatically because the trees have been able, over much of the past several months, to accumulate a lot of reserved carbohydrates. They've produced a lot of photosynthates. And so therefore, if you lose some leaves, even if you have a severe defoliation, it's probably not going to affect them dramatically unless it happens for multiple years. Kind of the same thing, but it's quite different with some, for example, the forest tent caterpillar or the spongy moths, where they're spring feeders. And they can cause a lot more damage because they're forcing the trees to develop new leaves again. It takes a lot of energy for them to do that. And so anyway, I'm just showing the photograph. That red oval shape is where you know it's a caterpillar, because in this case, if you can count them, if you see them, they got 4 pairs of prolegs. Now, caterpillars can have anywhere from 2 to 5 pairs of prolegs. Now, also they have stiff hairs at the bottom of these prolegs, and they're called crotchets, or if you're French, crochets, and they help the caterpillar to hang on to leaf surfaces. And then, for example, with the sawflies, which kind of looks like caterpillars, they have 6 pairs of prolegs, but they don't have any of the stiff hairs on the bottom of their prolegs. So, all right. So, and then as they finish their life cycle, they'll feed all the way, through August and through in September, and then finally they pupate, and you'll start to see these big caterpillars start to wander around. They move off the trees, and they can get kind of solitary at that point, perhaps, and you'll see them maybe move perhaps many 10s, 20, 30 yards or more away from the tree they were feeding on, and then they'll look for a soft soil, and they'll try to burrow down maybe a good 3 inches or so down in the soil, and then that's where they'll pupate, and they overwinter as pupae in that areas in the soil. Okay, all right. And just real quick here, showing you the foliation. And when they do feed, they feed in clumps and groups, one branch at a time, and then they'll move on. And so if you have a small tree, you can just simply remove that branch, and maybe they take off much of a population of a small tree without too much trouble. You see the adult moth with those 2 white spots, and there's that dark diagonal line there that kind of gives it a chevron look to it. And so therefore, just showing you the bottom right where you've got 3 different instar stages. So that first instar is almost like a yellowish white color. Then mid instar, they turn yellow, and then that late instar, that black color with the yellow-orange striping that's longitudinal down the body of the caterpillar. And so finally, as far as controls, let's see, we got some contacts that work well, pyrethroids and carbaryl. And if you can get coverage, that's always the problem with those materials because you have to have good coverage. You have some systemic materials like abamectin. There is one that if it's a large, and this is not really a nursery concern, but if you have a real large, say, tree like I do in my front yard, a large pin oak, about 40 feet in size, and you could do a systemic emamectin benzoate, which is the same that's used against the emerald ash borer. That could be attempted to control if you got a real severe population that's creating a nuisance or a problem year after year to maybe one of your oak trees. All right, so there's simply a list of biorationals there. I think most of you are familiar with many of those. The BT, of course, spinosad, chlorantraniliprole, which is really one that without any caution label to it, and you got an IGR listed there. And then oils and subs can work, but usually against young larvae with good coverage. And of course, also with BT, you got to get them when they're young as well. All right, so I've finished, and let me turn it over to our anchor man, Dr. Tim Waller.
All right, well, hey everyone. Well, hey again. So we're going to talk about one more insect, then we're going to get into some diseases and some resources y'all have available to you through us. So I guess I'm working with tulip tree today, but we have another pest, tulip tree aphid. These aphids, we're going to find them on the bottom of leaf surfaces, just like many of our aphids. They're going to be this pale yellow appearance, but they can range to almost a reddish pink appearance. And this can be different stages of their life and populations. Like all of our aphids, if the population builds up too high, we're going to start to have damages. We're going to have curling, discoloration. We can also have honeydew being formed, which can lead to sooty mold, as well as the increase of activity of things like ants and potentially wasps as well. So what we're going to talk about here, the 2 main identifying features of this is that they are localized to the tulip tree, and their antennae typically extend beyond their body. And we can see that in this image here. So if you're working with the tulip tree, you have pale yellowish, greenish, maybe pinkish aphids, and their antennae are fully extended past their body. There's a really good probability we're now dealing with tulip tree aphid. So like our other aphids, they're parthenogenic, meaning that they're pretty much born pregnant. So we can have population explosions and overlapping populations that can build up very rapidly. One thing I didn't note is that the adults are going to overwinter in the bark scales or very, very close to the buds for the next season. Unlike some of the other aphids that may have an off the tree life cycle component, these are already in the court where they're going to be causing the most damages. These are very much food for our beneficial insects, though. In the images here, we've got a syrphid fly that's noted, and it's very, very tiny. So this syrphid fly at this stage in the game is not going to be able to take out a full-size adult, but it will rapidly devour much smaller young of the season aphids. In the bottom pictures here, we've got a ladybird beetle. The ladybird beetle will feed in the adult form, but their nymphs are much more aggressive towards these aphids. And we can see here is that we've got a cluster of ladybird beetle eggs placed in an area with a high pest population. So when they emerge, their babies are going to have something to eat. And all of this is just to say, too, is to be cognizant, treatments may not be immediately needed. And if this is supporting a really good population of beneficial insects, that should have some bearing on how we approach our treatment regimes. So like I said, there's a lot of natural predators for them as well, and kind of the general list of things that work for our aphids across the board. Again, we've got our pyrethroids, things like carbaryl, but you have to get them to the location. underside of the leaves, which is often difficult in larger plants. And again, those two materials can have some pretty big impacts on our beneficials that are doing work for us on many other plants other than the tulip trees. Systemic materials can be effective. Abamectin is oftentimes a good rotational partner. And there are many other compounds that we can use against these aphids, but bear in mind that it is important that our beneficial insects will do a lot of good work for us. All right, so I wanted to get into a couple diseases. As I was making these slides, realizing that I really should have some more standalone about some of the diseases that we're going to be talking about. I tried to provide some resources, but so first we're going to talk about vascular disorders and diseases. And that's kind of a broad term, but I really want to break it down into our fungal-based vascular issues and our bacterial-based vascular issues. And there's a lot of minutia between all of the diseases that we could talk about. So in the case of fungal wilts, this is a fusarium diagram, and basically what this is showing us is that there are many survival structures that could be in the soil or contaminated media. They come in through either the root system or in the crown of the plant. In some cases, they can get in through above ground parts of the plant, but they get into the vasculature of the plant, oftentimes in the xylem, in some cases very close to the phloem as well. And they're pretty much gumming up the works. They are slowing that plant's ability to shuttle water and resources. Hence, we get a wilt associated with this vascular issue. As it goes through its life cycle, again, it goes into producing many forms of propagals, whether that's above ground or different survival structures that could be below ground. We're going to talk about that in a couple slides here. And then with bacteria, there are bacterial issues that can be, let's say, soil derived or media derived, but in a lot of cases, our bacterial issues are getting vectored around either by human beings with our cultural practices or by some form of an insect vector. And basically, we've got this repeating phase where we can continue to cause diseases to get spread around. And it all leads to the same issue where we've got our vascular tissue that's being gummed up and being destroyed in many cases, and the plant can no longer bring the resources. That's why these vascular issues almost always result in some form of wilting. So I'm not an expert in this, but since we're talking about vascular disorders and diseases, this is something that everyone should do a little homework on. This is vascular streak dieback. You'll see it as VSD. And this is a contemporary disease. People have been working on this for a few years now, and there's definite back and forth about what organism is actually causing this. So there's a Ceratobacillium. There's one that they found in chocolate that they think is one of the main possibilities of what this could be. But if you look into the literature, all of the treatments that are geared toward protecting plants from this are based around Rhizoctonia. And all of those are really focused on soil drenches and preventative maintenance and making sure your plants are staying nice and healthy. So this has not been officially identified in New Jersey yet. However, we're bringing in plants from regions that have absolutely had this, particularly in southern parts of the United States. So it's something that you really should be doing homework on. I know y'all can't read this list of susceptible plants, but that's kind of on purpose. The more we look at this, the more and more plants that we're seeing that can be attacked by this particular disease. So the images right here under the vascular streak dieback, what we're really looking for when we're cutting into the tissue is we're looking at the vasculature. Is the vasculature been disrupted? And is it being disrupted in some type of uniform way? With the VSD, we're going to see this ring that's right under the cork cambial layer, and it is pretty distinctive. If you peel back the bark, again, we're going to start to see discoloration. And what we're really seeing there is we've got all these tissues that have a function, and that function is being destroyed. So that's going to lead to tip dieback, flagging, overall plant death. What's important to note, though, is that there are many other pathogens that can have very similar phenotypes, particularly Botrysphaeria and Phomopsis. There are different telltales between these two, but if we look at that first image here under the word Botrysphaeria, we're seeing how it's not a very uniform type of cell death. We're seeing this cankering. We're seeing we have right under the cortical tissue, we've got xylem and we've got phloem that are all being destroyed. This is where incubation could be really valuable to us. We'll see different zones of death, and if we put this into incubation, we may be able to get different spore types out. I just wanted to include this slide here because all of us in the Northeast really should be paying good attention to this disease and be doing some more homework on it. And personally, I'm trying to get some more information out to everyone. And just a couple reminders here. We're talking about sanitation. A lot of these vascular diseases are incredibly difficult to control once it's in there. Many of them, once that vascular disease is in there, when it comes to a saleable plant, we've kind of missed the boat. So sanitation is always important. I've used this slide before, but making sure that we are cleaning up the area where we're growing plants over and over can be really beneficial to us as far as guarding against different diseases. And I've used this slide before too, but many of the vascular issues that we are going to run into, and I've seen this personally many, many times, is we're having vascular issues in plants that are grown in pot and pot production. If we have a perfectly clean pot that we are growing our plants in, but we're putting it into a socket that has had multiple rounds of diseased plant material grown in there, and we aren't sanitizing our emitters, we're changing out our emitters, we're asking for that problem to happen over and over again. So this is going to happen with things like Verticillium, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and all the mycetes, which are a little more than a vascular issue. This is something that's very important. Sanitation is a big deal, and this is a direct thing we can do to control these particular pathogens, because like I said, chemically based, they are very difficult to control. And then just good pruning habits. Granted, some of these vascular issues, you may not be stopping that disease. In other cases, you may be able to prune out the diseased tissues. In the case of Botrysphaeria, that's a canker fungus. Looks very similar to vascular issues, and we can prune that kind of stuff out. You just need to make sure that you're taking care to properly sanitize all of your pruning equipment and all those good best practices when it comes to reducing overall disease spread. Working with clean plants, making sure you're sterilizing your equipment, and trying to be cognizant of what plants you're working in and the next plants that you're going to work in. So, yeah, I'm running out of time here, and there's a bunch of things that we could talk about. So we talked a little bit about fungal, and as time progresses, we're going to get more into both the root and the vascular diseases. But the other wheelhouse of vascular diseases and disorders are the bacteria and the phytoplasma. A great kind of the poster child for a bacterial vascular issue is bacterial leaf scorch. I'm sure you're familiar with this in the landscape. It is possible that there could be some relay into the nursery, but I just wanted to use it as an example of bacteria and phytoplasma issues in general. Managing these chemically is all but impossible. However, in some instances, when we are trying to manage bacteria and phytoplasma and virus issues for that matter, what we can do is target the vectoring insect. In the case of bacterial leaf scorch in the landscape, this is really not possible, but in a smaller nursery setting with more control over what's happening, much smaller plants, we can have some impact in slowing down these vascular issues that can cause problems. Bacteria and phytoplasma work the same way. They gum up many times the xylem. They gum up the plumbing. The plant can no longer use water or pull up resources from the ground. And this leads us to leaf scorching, wilting, and overall stem and plant dieback. So what's an important question here too is, can you actually manage this disease? So if we look at, we'll use Fusarium as an example. Fusarium is kind of that's what that image is there. It produces many types of survival structures. If we're growing plants in the ground and we are losing plants over and over to these vascular wilt issues, it's really time to evaluate, can we actually grow a successful plant in this particular location? This is where we get into steam sterilization, solarization, but it may be beneficial to physically remove soil out of that system if you're trying to grow plants in there. And this is because their survival structures can live for such long times. If you're in a container system, this is where we are evaluating, is that socket pot clean? Or has our media pile been sitting out and getting rained on and all kinds of runoff running into it? That's another place for us to evaluate it. And like I said earlier, when it comes to bacteria and phytoplasma, what is the insect vector or a mechanical vector, and can we do something about it? And I just wanted to end here, or start to wrap up here, is just to relay that in the folks in this program, we've got access to some really cool imaging stuff. That microscope in the center there, if you've seen me come out with a giant case, that's the microscope that I have in there. And it's really cool because you can see what's going on. One of the big tenets of IPM is visually seeing what you are dealing with so we can make the best choices when it comes to very expensive chemicals and very real implications when it comes to biology. So we've got all these imaging things available, stereoscopes. I have an inverted scope for looking at media, like that image right here, compound microscopes. And if there's something else you need to look at, we'd absolutely be able to help facilitate that. You know, this and some of the uses here is here we figured out what the root disease was that was causing an issue in ilex. This is Sclaviopsis. Trying to figure out what type of beneficial insects we had in an area before we pulled the trigger to spray. Here we've got a lacewing larva. Trying to figure out what's going on with arborvitae. We've got spruce spider mite. We're trying to see if there were predaceous or parasitoid organisms for a scale infestation. Here we found the scale crawlers, but we also found parasitoid wasps in that process as well. And then here we've got potato leafhopper. And again, all of these where we were trying to figure out what's going on so we could select the right material or the right approach. And when we start really thinking about it, it's more than just IPM. That's good for our businesses. So next week, we are going to have Rich Buckley from the Plant Diagnostic Lab here at Rutgers talking about what they've been seeing this last season. I think this is a great thing to add to the group. I'm hoping to get them involved early on in the sessions next time as well. But they get all kinds of samples. They've got years and years and years of experience looking at trends, and I'm excited for this presentation. So if you have questions, please feel free to bring them. And like always, that update section that we did earlier in this particular talk, that's because people reached out to us and said, hey, there's something going on here. We'd like to talk about something. And we're always open to ideas, anything that you would like us to talk about. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for attending, and we are going to stop the recording.